It gives me great pleasure to welcome to the stage our panelists and our moderator, Jodi Schneider, Senior International Editor at Bloomberg News and co-lead for the Bloomberg Women's Community in Hong Kong.
We were just saying these are comfier chairs than they usually put you on those big stools, so we're happy about that. I have a fabulous panel and very little time, so we're going to get right to this. I'm going to go through the introductions quickly. I talk fast. Emily Steele, sitting right next to me, is an award-winning business journalist who's worked at the New York Times since 2014. Her reporting uncovered a series of settlements totaling $45 million related to the sexual harassment allegations against Bill O'Reilly, the former Fox News host. And along with a team of reporters who exposed sexual harassment and misconduct, she was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for public service in 2018, the highest honor that you can get in U.S. journalism, as well as several other journalism awards. And she's working here in Hong Kong for the Times. Next to her, we have Fiona Nott, who is CEO of the Women's Foundation, and she's basically combining her senior leadership experience with the mission of TWF to serve marginalized women and girls in Hong Kong, and works on this issue across the corporate space. Next to her, we have Sandhya Menon, who is a journalist with over 15 years of experience with national newspapers, and she's an independent journalist and helped to bring about the MeToo movement in India via social media. So we're going to get right to the first question, and I'll start with you, Emily. Each of you has come to this issue differently and helped move forward the conversation about Me Too. Talk a little bit about what it was like at the very beginning, because this was not an easy conversation to have, and all of a sudden it exploded. What was that like in that moment?
Right. So to go back to the very beginning, I started to report on this issue all the way back in the summer of 2016. I was a media business reporter, so I was covering the business of the media, and one of the big stories that summer was the sexual harassment scandal at Fox News. So I don't know if you all remember, but the chairman of the network, Roger Ailes, was sued by an anchor, and it exploded into this huge story that was just like days after days after days of coverage, and he ultimately was ousted. And the editor of the New York Times, Dean Baquet, said, I think there's something more here. We should keep digging. So he assigned me and my coworker, Michael Schmidt, who is, if you listen to The Daily, he's very famous, to start digging into the case of Bill O'Reilly, who at the time was the most powerful man in all of cable news, was making $25 million a year, bringing in hundreds of millions of dollars to the network, and was really this hugely, hugely powerful star. So Mike and I started with this case way back in 2004 where he had been accused of sexual harassment. We started digging and digging and digging, and ultimately, if you fast forward 8 months, what we found was that there had been a series of settlements involving allegations of sexual harassment against him that we now know total $45 million. And then at the same time, the company, which was the Murdoch Empire, had said that they were committed to creating an atmosphere based on trust and respect. They had been settling these allegations that these women had brought, and also were giving him a big pay bump. So what happened when that story published is it really exploded, and there were protests. People went online to share their own experiences with sexual harassment using hashtag to fire Bill O'Reilly. And the editors of the New York Times took note, and they said, we really need to dig in. And so reporters in the newsroom kind of fanned out and started to look into Silicon Valley and Harvey Weinstein and auto workers in Ford. And so kind of the rest is now history.
Did it surprise you that it spread like wildfire at the time?
When we were in the middle of the reporting, it was we had to pay so much attention to kind of following the facts and getting the documents and making sure that every detail was fair and accurate. Yeah, that it was almost like we lost sight of the bigger picture. And then when it did explode, when everybody did start talking about it, it just was so extraordinary.
Sandhya, I wanted to ask you about your experience in India, because it was somewhat different. You all took, great risk, went online, and people started telling their stories. Talk a little bit about that and what that was like.
So, which is completely different from what Emily's done, right? There was months of work that was involved in reporting about a certain case. When in India, I think it started with just a couple of isolated incidents with was actually a year back, just when it broke in the US. There was a list that came about men in academia, harassers in academia, and that sort of died a quiet death for several reasons. And then exactly a year later, October 5th, 2018 is when I think there were a couple of tweets that were going around, and I decided to call out about 2 editors. And it was just, it was mostly, I think, I'm sorry to say, it just impulse more than anything else. And then from there on, the experience was, within the next 3 months, I had about 300 women writing to me on Twitter saying, we've got stories to tell you. And my experience was a little bit different in the sense that I went back to each of these stories that women talked about and each of these men that they named, and I asked around. So it was journalistic in the sense that I did my background work, asked questions, not just to them, but to the places that they worked at, the people that they worked with, but it didn't go on newspapers, or it didn't go into the media. In fact, in India, constantly the media has been one step behind those of us online breaking these stories. So I think the other difference was about 4 or 5 women who had similar stories or who were working in the similar beat got together. 6 of us were working with over 500 women writing to us within 2 months saying, these are our stories. It's very different from, and there's no, in a sense, when you look at it, it feels a bit strange because there's no legitimacy of a media house behind it, but these stories are true and real.
Fiona, can you talk a little bit about what's happening in the corporate space? Because you deal with a lot of companies, and here in Hong Kong, what has been happening, and kind of how did you find your way with all of this?
Yeah, well, I guess I'm coming at it from a slightly different perspective as a gender equality advocate. And just a bit of context, I think when we heard, obviously the global movement took off, and thanks very much to the groundbreaking journalists who are breaking these stories and individuals who are speaking up, we took a look at that and went, wow, what is happening in Hong Kong? We need to get a handle on this, and we need to advocate for change. So, and you would probably know that in Hong Kong there wasn't such a big movement of celebrities and others speaking up. It was a little bit muted. However, we dug deep, and this is relevant across society and also for business. So, the picture here in Hong Kong is that 1 in 7 women experience sexual assault, but 90% don't report. 24% of assaults in Hong Kong are individuals 16 and under. In terms of sexual harassment, the stats range from 10 up to 80% of women experiencing sexual harassment depending on the industry. Those stats are shocking for Asia's world city. And we were deeply shocked by really doing a deep dive into that. The interesting thing was, though, that the frontline NGOs, and even for us at the Women's Foundation, individuals were reporting into those frontline NGOs. They weren't talking publicly, but they were reporting around it. So essentially, we're really interested in why people aren't speaking up. What are the barriers? And I think they apply across society and in corporates. And so we're really interested in advocating around a few areas. One around the education system in Hong Kong, which is only really deals with anatomical issues in education system. The criminal law here is backward. We have no definitions of consent. We're advocating for mandatory sexual harassment training in corporations. We want the police to have a special unit for victims. And I think specifically for corporations, they're not immune. The normal playbook that happens globally of victims speaking up about sexual harassment, and then the corporation moving and saying, okay, that's fine, but actually what we're going to do is move you out of your corporation. We might get you to sign a non-disclosure agreement and make a payment, and that perpetrator ends up staying in the company. We know that happens here in Hong Kong. So it's quite interesting, I think, for corporations. A number of people are taking this quite seriously. They are putting it on their risk agendas. They are looking to reform their systems. And then there are others who just aren't. So it's an interesting area that we need to keep working on.
I wanted to ask about the backlash, because we hear that sometimes, and we hear it in some ways just about well-meaning male allies don't want to mentor women anymore, or particularly younger women. But in India, there's been an actual, real legal backlash, and also some women have faced violence. Can you talk a little bit about that, Sandhya, and tell us what's happening now?
So the defamation law has consistently been used to keep journalism or journalistic voices away from really breaking the big stories, and that's what we're facing. Most women who have, one of the biggest cases, which is a minister from the ruling party who was called out by over 12, 13 women, leading up to 33 women with little instances. He sued the woman who named him, and that sort of put a dampener on a lot of us. It sort of scared us, but it was interesting to see that women, especially young women, 27, 28, who just got past the point where they're easy to predate, you know, they're saying that's okay, I don't mind attracting a lawsuit. I was threatened with a lawsuit for something similar, which is I don't think the legal aspect is as worrying as what it does to the rest of your life when you're managing home, when you're managing work, when you're managing an entire life. I'm a single mom, so there's a double sort of thing on me to manage. And just apart from my perspective, when it goes the legal way, then there's how do you sort of prove that a man grabbed you and kissed you in a car at 12 a.m. and he was dropping you? There's no way that can happen. And then defamation is such a tight law in India. There's no getting out of it. And apart from the legal backlash itself, there's just intense online trolling, and a lot of young women in India are online. And the kind of trolling they face, the kind of backlash they're facing within families, where parents, my own parents are sort of, are you sure this is what you want to do? And, you know, I'm old enough to say that's okay, relax. But there are young women who are just, you know, who are cowed down by their parents saying, drop it, it's okay, move on. And that's what affects work, because then your productivity is just cut by half when your parents are telling you it's okay, we've faced this, mothers telling their daughters, we've faced this, look beyond, move on, do your work. And that's something that I think a lot of us are not able to navigate very easily at this point.
Fiona, you're a lawyer. Do you see there being, you know, legal ramifications to some of this, or is there a chilling effect, do you think, because of people taking actions, or is it more complicated than that?
I think it's a bit more complicated than that, but the defamation laws, I think, in India, Australia and the UK are quite different to the United States, actually. So they are being used as a weapon to silence people, and that is not okay. And I think what advocates are now doing is arguing for reform of defamation laws, as well as sexual assault and sexual harassment laws as part of that. In terms of other sort of backlash, there definitely is backlash. I mean, you hear the reports of, I think this year, I think Lean In has reported that 14% of men feel more strongly anti-MeToo than the year before, that 60% of men are saying that they will not mentor women one-on-one. They're the stats out of the United States. We don't have the stats for Hong Kong, but we do hear that, or that the Me Too movement has gone too far, that there's a lot of these accusations are false. But I do want to bring up just a bit of a bright spot, because I think if you just step back from the individual cases of backlash and look at really what's happened in the last 18 months or so about this, I mean, from my perspective, I think there's been actually a real support for gender equality. We're seeing that from corporates. Gender equality is now back on the agenda in a broad context, and that's a good thing. And we launched talking about male allies, we launched a male allies program at the Women's Foundation not long after Me Too. I thought I'd get 10 companies on board. We've got over 40 and 150 male allies who are signing up for pledges. And you may be a bit cynical about that, but these are guys who really are committing themselves to supporting this and going out and advocating for change. So I think there's a backlash, but there are some bright spots as well.
Yeah, Emily, it's been almost 2 years since the reporting, the groundbreaking reporting you did. What do you think? Do you think there is a backlash, or do you see hopeful signs as well?
One of the things that I think was really powerful about a lot of the reporting at the Times is that it didn't just focus on these individual cases, but it really exposed this entire system that had allowed this bad behavior to perpetuate. So there were issues with HR and the human resources departments protecting the executives rather than the employees. There were issues with non-disclosure agreements. There were issues with people not feeling comfortable speaking up. There were issues with the legal system. And we are starting to see some reform in each of those categories. And I think that is a bright light. But one of the things that I also think and I really have a sharp spotlight on trying to figure out is a lot of companies are saying that they care, are saying that they have zero tolerance policies, but then what happens when there is an incident?
I'm just going to interrupt Emily there to add that in India, that's the funny thing, right? There is by law a policy that every corporate follows. You have to follow you have to have that in place where everyone signs a thing that says you've been through the training or whatever, and every company has one of these, and yet it just stops in letter, right? So this is probably what you're going to see going forward. If the policy is there, why isn't it being implemented? That's the difficult bit.
Okay, very quickly, because we're going to try to get a couple questions in. We have a room full of media professionals here, the best and the brightest in Asia. What should we be covering? I mean, you don't have to disclose any secrets of what you're covering, although I'd love to know. But what should we be covering? Where should we go next with this? You want to start, Emily?
Yeah, I mean, I think it hits on the question that I just kind of raised before of a lot of people, a lot of companies are saying one thing, but then what are they actually doing? And I think that that's a really strong line of reporting.
Yeah. Fiona?
Well, I think, everybody here plays such an important part in this issue and reforming the world. But for journalism, where would we be in attacking these issues? And I think I would just say, look at the systemic problems. What Emily had been talking about. Go behind. There's the individual cases, but how can you challenge the narrative of the playbook of companies that go through that model of moving people out and not taking these issues seriously? Keep reporting on this stuff, because this is how we will affect systemic change. And thank you so much.
And Sandhya?
I think the stories now have to be more human than numbers. I think the stories have to be about the women who are married and are in relationships with the men that have been called out. That's a conversation we don't have. Another conversation we're not having is one about employability and letting men who've been called out back into society. That's something we don't talk about.
But also, what about the women who've been ostracized after they have been victims,
yes,
and what happens to their lives
so
and
those
their
are
careers too?
Those are stories, right? So a lot of men want to come back, and in India, a lot of men have come back and gone on completely comfortably with their lives. So how do we allow them back in? What are the parameters for letting them know that they're letting us know that they're trustworthy? The other thing is, I think, compliance as far as companies are concerned, at least for India. What are corporates, what are employers doing to make spaces safe? Those conversations are not happening at all. It's not enough to fulfill the law in its letter. The spirit doesn't transfer at all. These are stories, I think, and I think continued stories, at least as far as India is concerned, from disadvantaged groups of women from smaller towns, from villages, stories that we never hear. People who don't have social capital, people who don't have access to online, to social media, none of that. Those stories, they just don't happen, especially in Indian language media. That's not happening at all.
Okay, I think we have time for a few questions. Are there microphones? I don't know how this is working. You can bring microphones. Okay, are there a couple questions? We have time for a few questions. A room full of journalists and no question. It is sad. Oh, there's one over here. Yes, someone will bring a microphone.
Thank you, Tracy Alloway from Bloomberg. I was just wondering, when it comes to Asia in particular, are there any particular difficulties that you encounter when it comes to either covering these issues or trying to fix them? I hear a lot about cultural relativism, for instance. A lot of people say that people here are just more afraid of speaking out. Are there any things specific to the Asia region that you've encountered?
Yeah, Emily, you want to take that one first since you worked in the U.S. and then here?
Yeah, one thing that was really kind of shocking to me is it wasn't that I was just working in the U.S., but I was working kind of from the epicenter of this movement of journalism and reporting at the New York Times, and it was like the New York Times had become the nation's HR reporting line, and we were just getting tip after tip after tip, and everybody wanted to talk to us. And then I landed here, and nobody wanted to talk. And it's interesting because there's just not as many public stories, but then when you start to kind of burrow underneath the surface, there are a lot of stories and there are a lot of things that people want to say and want to change. And so it's just figuring out how you can report these stories without necessarily putting a lot of the burden on victims coming forward. Because that's one of the things I've been thinking a lot about. It's like with this and even the abortion rights situation that's happening in the States, there's so much emphasis on getting women to come forward to talk, to share their stories that are about these big systems. And I've just been thinking a lot about like how does that shift? How does that change?
And it's been playing out differently in Asia, right? In Japan, they call it MeToo, that it's a collective movement that people come forward. You probably have a perspective on that, Sandhya, from India.
I think culturally the difference in India has been the fact that there's a large section of women that's been completely ignored because of their lack of access, right? And because they're also from social locations that are extremely powerless. They just haven't been able to speak or organize. The other thing is women standing up for their own men. I mean, it happens everywhere, but we've seen divorces and stuff like that happen with men who are called out in the West. But in India, they haven't moved. In fact, they've gotten back and said, hey, listen, do you want to listen to our story? Do you want to listen to our side of things? And it's not the men who are coming forward and saying that, it's the women that they're with coming and saying, hey, we've got another side to the story. I think those two are very sharp differences that I've seen in India as opposed to the rest of it.
Any other questions? Okay. Okay. I don't see any hands, so I think that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jodi, Emily, Fiona, and Sandhya for that great panel. And we do look forward to a lot more stories.